Yes, thanks, Jean-Pascal, for the introduction and for organizing this session. So I'm actually a postdoc in Jean-Pascal Pfister's lab, and my talk will be about some theoretical and methodology aspects in nonlinear filtering. So when we talk about nonlinear filtering, we actually mean stochastic filtering, which is sequential Bayesian inference from a stream of observations or measurement data. So these could be either discrete or continuous time. And some generic applications of this is for state or parameter estimation in latent variable models. Essentially, every time you want to estimate parameters, you have a built-in filtering or smoothing task, whether you use expectation maximization or a gradient-based approach for parameter estimation. And also for stochastic control in the presence of uncertainty. You also have to do filtering. Within neuroscience, there are many different applications. So one of them would be to learn dynamic latent variable models from neural data. Another one would be for decoding the stimuli from neural recordings, as in this picture here. If we have an animal which is taking a walk in the plane, and then we have neural recordings from play cells, we could do filtering in order to decode the position from those neural recordings. And one application which our group has also been working on, and others, would be as a model for Bayesian computation in the brain, for example, for perceptual inference or synaptic plasticity. So in my talk here, I will focus on unweighted particle filters, which have been one of my main interests over the last years. And I will present two recent projects. One of them was with Ehsan, who was a visiting master student in our lab, and is really about the gauge freedom, what we call, I will talk about this later, within particle filters in general. And with Anna and Jean-Pascal, we worked on unweighted particle filters for point process observations, and for hidden states which are living in a manifold. So I will, before talking about these two projects, I will first recap the feedback particle filter, and this will also allow me to introduce the filtering problem. So the feedback particle filter is an elegant approach for particle filtering, which is based on mean field control. So the reason why one may look at unweighted particle filters as opposed to weighted particle filters, which are kind of the standard already for almost 30 years now, is that particle filters based on weights or on importance sampling may behave quite poorly in high dimensional problems, because essentially importance sampling behaves poorly in high dimensions. And unweighted particle filters are thought to mitigate this issue. And the feedback particle filter is one such approach, which is based on mean field control and has been originally formulated for the classical nonlinear filtering problem in continuous time, but has since been extended to various other models. And I will talk about one such extension in the second part of my talk. So the classical nonlinear filtering problem is a model where both the signal, the hidden process or latent process, is given by a diffusion process, as is the observation process. And the noise is basically modeled by these Wiener processes, which are assumed to be independent. And the task in filtering is really to find the conditional distribution of the hidden state given all the past observations. And we denote this conditional distribution as PT throughout the talk. So in an unweighted particle approximation, this distribution is approximated by an equally weighted sample of particles, each of which has some dynamics, which can be decomposed into two parts. So there are the prior dynamics, which essentially mirror the dynamics of the hidden state, as you can see here, and a bunch of control terms, which depend explicitly on time and also on the observations. And now the goal is to find those coefficients, U and K, those nonlinear functions, such that the particle population best matches or tracks the posterior distribution. So I will briefly sketch the derivation. So here is our ansatz for the particle dynamics. And in order to derive the appropriate choice of U and K, what we do is we write down the filtering equation, which is quite classical result, old result from the 60s, which is basically an equation for the time evolution of the conditional distribution, which is given in terms of the prior dynamics, which is the Fokker-Planck term, which would appear also in the unconditional distribution. But then there is a correction term or observation term, which takes into account the observation process. And we also write down the distribution of the particles themselves, which is just the forward equation, Kolmogorov forward equation, for the conditional distribution of the particles given the observations. And then what we do is we just match these two equations term by term, and we get conditions for optimality, which can be expressed as two PDEs for the two coefficients K and U. In terms of the nonlinearity observation function H and its expectation. And these equations are really, I really want to focus a bit for the first part. So the first part will be about what we call gauge freedom, which is a quite general issue, as I'll explain in unweighted particle filters. And the basic observation is that if you look at these equations, they are equations which constrain the divergence, the weighted divergence of two vector fields in terms of some terms that depend on the model. And it's well known that you can always modify, if you have a solution to these equations, you can always modify it by terms which are divergence free. If you want to just picture this, if you have the contour line of your distribution, you would basically choose a vector field that flows along the contour lines and doesn't change the distribution. And if you add such a vector field to whatever solution you already have, you get another solution. So the solution is never unique. However, in the literature, there has been a standard choice, which would be to minimize the energy of the vector field under this constraint. And under some conditions on P and H, this gives a unique solution in terms of a gradient that can be expressed as a gradient. And for the function U, this particular solution has been chosen. So it's really an interesting question how to justify this particular cost function and this particular choice, because it doesn't emerge from the filtering problem as such. So we looked at the linear model as an example, because in the linear model, one can express everything in closed form, both the conditional distribution as well as the corresponding feedback particle filter. And really, the exact filter is also a classical result in filtering theory. It's called a Kalman-Bussy filter. If the initial distribution is Gaussian and the model is linear and Gaussian, then the posterior distribution will also be Gaussian, and you get some equations for the mean and the covariance matrix as a function of time. And one important term to emphasize here would be this prefactor. So the Kalman filter has this gain times error structure, and the gain, which is called Kalman gain, would be the covariance matrix times C transpose. And this is what we will also see in the feedback particle filter. So the corresponding feedback particle filter looks very similar. Actually, it looks like a noisy version of the Kalman-Bussy filter with two important differences. So one of them is, of course, this noise term, which adds some fluctuations in between the particles. And also this innovation term is different because it mixes the particle's own prediction with the population average mu. And important to note is here that the gain is equal to the Kalman gain. So what people have realized in the past is that these dynamics can be modified quite a bit without changing the distribution. As I highlighted earlier, in terms of these divergence-free vector fields, in the linear case, one can actually explore the full degree of freedom in this particle filter without affecting the distribution. And this is what we did in our paper from last year. We extended the symmetries that were already discovered in previous works and explored the full degree of freedom. And basically, we're able to show that all these additional terms, such as these Q-symmetric terms or additional noise terms, can be viewed as time-dependent transformations. And that's why we call them gauge freedom or gauge transformations in analogy to physics. So at each point in time, we can have a transformation GT, which takes the shifted particle position and reshapes it, but such that this equation holds, which basically means that the covariance matrix is preserved. So all these gauge symmetries can really be exploited, for example, in neuroscience models of filtering in order to align the dynamics to something that matches biology more closely. But in the context of filtering as such, it's still an open question as to the significance of these symmetries. But it's important to realize that the optimality principles that were chosen as a standard choice before are kind of ad hoc and are not clearly justified. So let me just make a small remark that this entire issue of gauge symmetries is also related to optimal transport, specifically to the dynamical formulation of optimal transport, which is known as the Benamou and Brunier formula. So here the idea is that if you want to measure the Wasserstein-2 distance between two distributions, which is one of the optimal transport distances, you can do so by considering various different paths, continuous paths between these distributions, which solve a continuity equation and then minimize the total energy. So the integrated energy of the vector field that matches here. So it's kind of a nested optimization problem over all possible trajectories and all possible vector fields, minimizing the total energy. And this has been also applied to Bayesian inference and is known there as ensemble transform or particle flow method. And I'll talk more about this in the second part. So this is really the segue also to the second part. And here I will focus on feedback particle filters for a different observation process than what we had in the first half. We still have a hidden process which is a diffusion, but now the observation will be an inhomogeneous Poisson process whose intensity or rate function depends on the hidden state. And as I showed in the beginning, one application would be for place cells, which have location-dependent firing rates, and the filtering problem would be to decode the position. But actually, how we formulated the problem was actually for hidden processes on manifolds, and manifolds are important for various different applications in neuroscience. If you think about orientation tuning or head direction cells, for example, those states naturally live on manifolds such as a circle or even spheres or other manifolds. And therefore it's good to have a particle filter algorithm that can deal with these state spaces. And yeah, so we will derive a feedback particle filter from first principles from the corresponding filtering equation, which is also quite an old result, but it's worth mentioning here. So this is the corresponding filtering equation for the point process observation model. And it looks quite similar to the previous one, except that here we now have a jump term which takes into account the update in response to a spike or to an event, which comes from the inhomogeneous Poisson process. So let me just talk about a previous approach to this problem, which was called Ensemble Kushner-Satonovich-Poisson filter, or EKSPF. So this one was actually also inspired by the feedback particle filter and has this same structure of prior dynamics plus a modification or control term, which is of this gain times error structure. But in contrast to the feedback particle filter, where the gain is a solution to a PDE, the gain here is simply a constant that was assumed to be given by this covariance divided by expectation of H. And there are a couple of issues with this filter. So it can work fine in some cases, but the constant gain that is really baked in really prevents it to be extended or further refined to other settings where the constant gain doesn't work. And one reason why the constant gain doesn't work so well in many cases is because if you have a spike here, the response to the spike will be a uniform translation of all the particles. So only the mean gets adapted, but the variance doesn't get adapted. So there's no proper variance reduction in response to the observation. And therefore, there's a mismatch between, quite a strong mismatch between the posterior and the particle approximation. And another reason why the constant gain could be seen as problematic is that on a manifold, it's really not clear what it means for the gain to be constant. So I'll briefly illustrate this with this figure. So first of all, the particles simply get shifted. And what you would like to have is something that also takes into account the reduction in uncertainty in response to an observation. And if you have a hidden state on a circle and you have a bunch of particles here, if you make an observation, the particles should actually cluster in a certain region of the state space, such as here. And this doesn't occur with a translation. For example, this on a circle would be a uniform rotation, which doesn't accomplish what you want to do. And maybe as a more broader argument for why a constant gain is problematic, it is really not that well defined on the manifold, because if you change the embedding, for example, of the manifold, you also change the notion of constancy. So this wasn't taken into account in the previous approach. So what our contribution was to really formulate the feedback particle filter from first principles, going back to the filtering equation, trying to derive the particle dynamics correspondingly. So the key here is really to split the filtering equation into the parts between the spikes and the part where the spike occurs. So in between the spikes, we have actually a normal PDE, which is a modification of the Fokker-Planck equation. And at the time of a spike, so if this increment is positive, then the posterior distribution is multiplied by the observation function and then renormalized. So there's a multiplicative thing going on. So correspondingly, we have the particle dynamics, which are also split into parts. So in between the spikes, we add an additional drift term, which satisfies this PDE, which again comes from matching this equation 25 to the equation 27, as in the classical feedback particle filter. And at the time of the spike, we use a transformation T in order to transform the particles from the prior distribution to the posterior. And this is what I mentioned earlier as particle flow, and we use a similar idea here. So we choose an interpolation of the prior just before the spike and the posterior, which would be the distribution just after the spike, which we call QS. And here we choose an exponential interpolation, which is basically an exponential family that interpolates between those two distributions. So for S equals 0, we would have simply 1 here, and then we have the prior, Q0. And for S equal 1, we would have the posterior, which is likelihood times prior, and so on with normalization. So if we differentiate this with respect to S, we get this structure, which looks very similar as what we had for the feedback particle filter and for the continuous update in the current filter that I'm just talking about now. And we can, again, equate this with a divergence of a vector field. And then this vector field is really doing an infinitesimal transformation that will integrate up to the full transformation. So basically the difficult problem of matching the prior and the posterior, this transport problem, is split into many small parts, and then the small parts can be solved individually. Yes, so we ran also a bunch of simulations in order to show that this algorithm does what we hoped it would do. So here we are comparing on R on a very simple 1D example that essentially the performance is the same across all 4 of the algorithms that we looked at. So these are bootstrap particle filter, the EKSPF, which was this previous approach, a simple assumed density filter, and this would be our filter, which is a point process feedback particle filter. And really the performance in terms of mean squared error is the same across all filters in this case, but the variance in the EKSPF is really underestimated here, while all the other filters, even a very simple ADF, take into account the proper uncertainty. And we also checked this on various manifolds. I'll show just the example for the circle. So on the circle, because the EKSBF was not really designed to be used on a manifold, its performance is quite bad. Actually, its root mean squared distance or error is actually twice as big as you would hope based on some benchmark or our filter. And also the estimation of uncertainty is also quite off. Yeah, so just to summarize a few takeaway messages. So for the feedback particle filter or for filtering in general, there's an inherent gauge freedom, and this freedom manifests both in the PDEs and can be also seen in the transport formulation for static inference, as I briefly remarked. You can choose an optimal transport map, but you don't have to because it's not really part of inference. And so this question of the role of the transport cost is really largely unclear at this point, and really an interesting question to talk about. And regarding the second project, I try to explain why constant gains are problematic on manifolds, but also in terms of uncertainty quantification on Euclidean space. And an important thing I forgot to mention, but the feedback particle filter, because we split it into jump and between jump, so we do this separation, we really lose the gain times error structure that was present in the feedback particle filter, which is also an interesting takeaway, that this gain times error structure, while it is always present in the filtering equation, it doesn't have to be present necessarily in the particle dynamics corresponding to this filtering problem. And using a particle flow method, actually, we can get better quantification of uncertainty. Let me just end by showing the detailed references. So I talked about these two papers in my talk. And if you want to learn more just about nonlinear filtering in general, actually a tutorial just came out about nonlinear filtering in general. And we also wrote this review about scalability of particle filters, as I briefly mentioned, with respect or compared to weighted approaches in high dimensions. And I'll just briefly show also the other references in case you want to copy them or from the recording. Yes, and let me end by thanking you for attending.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Simone, for this actually very impressive talk. So just a comment to the attendees, they can put questions in the Q&A form. And since there's no question right now, maybe I'll just start. So actually it was really interesting, right? So we had Manish talking about the linear dynamical system, and then Anki on the GP latent variable model, right? And now a full diffusion process for, on manifold for latent, for your latent variable model. So maybe the first question regarding part one, right? So you have this freedom, this gauge freedom. You mentioned a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how you could exploit it, right? So you can add some divergence free vector field, but can you use this, I don't know, for robustness or stability of the filter? Or if you were to implement it into some physical device where you could minimize some energy, or can you speculate a little bit?
Yes, so really one of the points that I try to make is that the cost function that was classically taken for this vector field was just a L2 energy, and this L2 energy is not really coming from the filtering problem or from the probabilistic structure of the problem. So actually by taking into account this freedom and putting various different cost functions, we could actually exploit it in order to perform certain tasks that we care about. So for example, we could try to minimize other cost functions that have some relationship with physical quantities. If we think about dynamics in the brain, we could think about metabolic costs or costs of putting a filtering algorithm on hardware. And this is really the freedom we should use in order to find algorithms that best suit our purposes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
but I think from a theoretical perspective, this is still an open question. Why would optimal transport be the right way to propagate the particles.
And I think we have another question from Andre. So maybe you can give it live already instead of me just repeating the question, if you're willing to.
Yeah, I just, thanks Simone for the talk. It was very interesting. I tried to understand what was the context when you're separating your kernels like between this during spike and between spike. What happens if you have multiple spikes and spike trains in parallel? Are you working with only one neuron, or are you controlling a bunch at the same time? You're doing this,
you could be working with multiple neurons, and you would have to basically account for each of the updates separately. So,
I see, okay.
So if you assume that the Poisson noise is really independent between neurons,
right.
So given the hidden state or the rate, then the noise will be independent. Then you can be sure that there will be not be two spikes at the same time. So basically, you can distinguish between these different updates, and you have to basically run this update for each of the spikes. Yes, according to the corresponding rate function.
And although the particle filtering with feedback dynamics are highly nonlinear, there's still an assumption of linear dynamics going on between spikes. Is that right? And then at the neural level?
It's just that the observation noise is assumed to be independent. Now, for filtering for correlated observation noise is a whole different ballgame. So we didn't look into that yet. So that would be one of the extensions to look at. Yes, okay. But it's not linear. It's just independent of the independence of the observation noise. That makes sense.
Thanks. There was also another question from Lucas Kuzniaks. So can your filter be generalized to non-linear noise? So in the hidden dynamics, right? So maybe Poisson noise or alpha stable, etc. Right. So you had your linear noise in the latent dynamics. Can you also work with other type of noise?
Yeah. So that's a really great question. In this approach, we looked at the Wiener process noise, but generally, from a general perspective, one could simply take the noise process and translate it to the particle dynamics. So the basic idea of feedback particle filters is that the particle dynamics are essentially given by the prior dynamics plus some correction. So if you have, let's say, colored or fractional Brownian motion noise or Levy process noise or whatever you want in the hidden dynamics, those would be also put into the particle dynamics. But the important question is always how to choose the correction or feedback term in order to track the posterior distribution. So that's still an issue, but it could certainly be generalized to other types of signal noise. Yes.
Okay, great. So I would like to thank Simone again for his really nice talk and bring really new interesting